Hey, what's going on, Team Trek family? Welcome back. In the studio tonight, we got another SF brother visiting all the way from 5th Group. I want to introduce my boy, Paul Bock. How you doing, brother?
Doing good, brother. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. Well, hey, Paul, listen, you know the podcast all too well. You know, we like to start by kind of digging into the background, finding out where you're from, getting to know you. So if you would, start us back. Where are you from? And just bring us up through school, kind of what type of person you were growing up, if you're into sports and things like that. But just give us a once over, if you would.
Born in Kansas. Dad was in the Air Force. Worked Titan II missile silos. Moved up to Montana, Great Falls. I was pretty little still. He got out. We moved over to Ohio. He got in the automotive industry, and then as he just moved up the chain, we just moved around a lot. Hit a couple places in Ohio. It's where I actually met my wife back when we were 10. I moved into her neighborhood, and then we from there went to Kentucky. Then from Kentucky, we were in Madisonville, about an hour north of Fort Campbell, 45 minutes from Fort Campbell. Then I moved up to Indiana, graduated there, tried college, didn't go so well. It was one that I don't really know what I want to do. Maybe I'll figure something out, but don't really want to go to college. And mom was like, "You're going to college?" I'm like, "Oh, okay. I guess I'm going to college. I guess I'll go to IU, the number one party school in the nation. Why not?" And I had a 4-year experience in about 6 months. Came home because I was like, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wasn't going to class, and it was one of those one of those we laugh about it because my dad still gives me grief. I came home for Christmas, and he got the grades, and they were all zeros. And as my wife likes to say, including racquetball. And how do you fail racquetball? You don't go to class. And so my I as soon as my dad had the grades, I said, "Dad, I know what I did." He's like, "Yeah, I know you did. You didn't go to class." So I came home, did some roofing, got into steel framing, construction. We were a non-union shop, so every now and then we'd run out of work out in Fort Wayne, and I had this horrible job. It sucked. It was called Hot Crews, and it was cleaning out furnaces and foundries so that they could, where all the iron ore and stuff had gotten everything, it needed to clean out the furnace. Then we'd relay all the brick. And so what it was you're in these furnaces for 10 to 12 hours straight with a 45 to 60 pound jackhammer, just 10 to 12 hours knocking that out. And so when they called "Hey, we got work back. Can you work?" I'm like, "Yes, get me out of here." So did that. Towers went down when I was a junior in high school. Was sitting in English or history class. I can't remember which one. So we watched the towers go down. My dad joined up then, went Army. He was going to go back into the Air Force into the officer corps, but then got in a real bad car wreck on a head-on collision. He was driving like a Geo Metro size and a old Chevy truck, and you know how those things were made, just head on him. So he got some surgery done, got some metal taken out of his body. He came back in the Army. He went to OIF 3. And at that point, I was working at Kitty Hawk Air Cargo in Fort Wayne, which was just a night shift, moving cargo off and on planes. And then during the day, I was a mall rat, and I worked at the mall at a cell phone kiosk. And you remember that. They used to change. It was the cool thing to change all the cases and all that stuff on the flip phones. That's what I did. So I was like, I'm not doing much of anything. I can't let you have all the fun because he was going to OIF 3. I knew I wanted to join the Army at that point, or go in the military at least. And so I'd been looking around, and I was pretty much set on special operations. My uncle was in Vietnam. My whole family's been in the military in every conflict, going back to the Revolution. My uncle is actually got the thing because Washington's 100, we were in that. Our ancestor was a medic for Washington. So talking to him, talking to my dad, and love the regular Army guys, love my 82nd kids, when I was overseas. But they said, "You will not make it in the regular Army," just straight up. And then I had a friend whose fiance was in the 18X program. So I walked into the recruiter. I said, "Tell me about the 18X program." And I'd actually signed up as a firefighter, and I had a spot on the reserve unit there in Fort Wayne. And I just felt like I can't go to that. I'm not going to do that. But it was just had that feeling. This isn't right. So I joined under the 18 X-ray program, and this was 05, so went to basic, went to airborne, hit SOPSI, which was a month long just slaughter fest, because back then it was the World War II barracks out at Pike Field. And anybody that came in back at that time knows exactly what I'm talking about. And I just happened to be lucky enough to hit the August class, which was, one, miserable. Two, we were the videotape class. And anybody that may have been from that time period will remember the videotape class, because what they were originally intent was, hey, you get selected, here's what you did. Just good fun memory. Because back then, they had the gig pits, they had the same, so without question, somebody's going to be screwed up, right? We've got everything was an SOP, right? How you tie your knot on this piece of the equipment with this much tail, with this type of locking knot. And they would go through, and you've got 100 some dudes in the class, and, they're going to check every little knot. And, you'd see the gigs popping up. And as my buddy, Matt Webb would say, he's like, I'm a W. He's like, as soon as they start checking, my hat's coming off, and all my stuff out of my pockets is going in my hat, because I know I'm going in the gig pit. But it was pretty horrible. They were smoking the dog piss out of us one day, and like we didn't get a lot of sleep. The meals were very much like, you have 2 minutes, shovel it down, and they were just smoking the heck out of us, and like. We're doing flutter kicks, and this guy's like, and he feels something, and he lifts up this like dead raccoon. And he's like, and they're like, throw it out, keep going. So it was just, anyway, did that, went to selection, finished the course in 07, went straight to 5th group, rolled over into OIF 5. Then just every year post that, Iraq. 2011, we rolled over into the VSO mission in Afghanistan. We went down to Helmand province, did 2 months in UAE. It wasn't horrible. It was, my wife kept giving me flack about how I was suffering for my country, because the first month was with the Emiratis, and what the goal was, and what the initial thought was, and what we were told was, hey, you're going to train with them, and then you as a unit are going to go together into Afghanistan. We're like, oh, okay, cool. So obviously, working with the Emirati SOF was very interesting. Anybody that's dealt with that, it understands. And then they found out where we were going, and they're like, yeah, well, we're not going there. And we're like, you can do that? You can just say no? Interesting. So, yeah, unexpected. So did that. And a lot of stuff went on. Obviously, I was burned out. My first wife had gone nuts and banged down a bunch of dudes and destroyed my house and blew all my cash first rotation. And then my wife, Kelsey, and I got back together, because we dated on and off and talked over the years, but just always kind of off cycle with each other, like she'd be dating somebody or I would. But we just, every 6 months, we'd be like, hey, how you doing? How's life? That. Didn't talk to her while I was married, because I don't play that game. Like, you don't have girlfriends. You don't talk to other women. But then I'm trying to think at that point. So then after Afghanistan, came home. I was a selection cadre. Well, I had a job lined up at PLDC BNOC at McCall, because I knew I didn't want to be on post, and I wanted to be at McCall on my SWIC tour, because I volunteered for SWIC after Afghanistan, because I was burned out. We'd lost 2 pregnancies, one right before the trip and one in the middle of the trip in Afghanistan. And they were just real rough trip. We lost our EOD tech 27 days before we came home, Chad Reg. They did a command dead on us because we were getting all their pressure plates. So daisy chain 3 IEDs, launched him about 40 meters, shot my buddy Joe, my Charlie, into the ditch. He's still in at 5th. And then from there, went to SWIC, got pulled into a school's position. And it was one of those, good old Sergeant Major Channing Bell was like, hey man, I know you didn't want this position, but I need you to rebuild it. And I know you. It's like, oh, so if I was a dirtbag, I'd go where I want to go? Yes. Dang it. Okay. All right. But God totally worked it out, because just a few months later, my wife got diagnosed with leukemia. So she went through a bone marrow transplant, started at UNC Chapel Hill, rolled us out to MD Anderson about a month later because cancer wasn't better. She had 3 of the worst mutations you could have. There's a whole story behind that we'll get into, I'm sure. Came back from that, rolled over to selection, had a blast as a selection cadre. Then I did that for a year and a half. Then I rolled into SFPC because SOPSI had changed to SFPC. Was a cadre there for a year and a half. Came back, rolled into A35, back to where I first started at 5th Group because my whole time was in 3rd Battalion. I did A35 and then C35. Took over as the op sergeant 2 weeks before we were heading to Syria. Rolled over there with my guys. Came home, was having a lot of issues cognitively. What I thought for years was me just being tired, op tempo, because it was about 09 since I'd been starting having these just interesting things that would happen. Like the room would feel really large, or I just get this weird feeling in my head, and I just kind of not fade out, but I just start to really struggle cognitively a little bit for a day or two. So I just thought it was the op tempo, not sleeping, because none of us were sleeping by that time and at our point in our careers, and it was actually me having seizures, like a ton of seizures. So ended up frying out real bad, and it was so bad, and it's comical now. But our buddy Phil, I'd met him in Syria, and he was gonna want to be one of the guys for my warrant packet. And I'm sitting there trying to figure the warrant packet. I'm like, is it really this difficult to do a warrant packet? Like, do I suck this much? And then I went down to inventory 3 things and couldn't figure out how to do it. And it turned out it was the seizures. I was just having so many seizures. And then my wife ended up having to do my ADLs for me. So she was making sure she was helping me with my showers, get me dressed, feed me, because I was so fried. Don't really remember a lot. I remember some things, but I don't remember a lot of the stuff at that time. Ended up getting medically retired in 19, and then from there my wife encouraged me, hey, go get your master's in biblical studies, you're going to use it. And then I contracted for a little bit in 2020 right before COVID broke out, and it was really cool because I ended up doing it was RAVAC kits, Green Force tracking, 9602 installs, but it was at the Siege of Sodif in Baghdad. And Mo was the group sergeant major at the time, and he was my old team sergeant, and the DCO was my old team captain. So it was awesome because I knew people. And then another buddy of mine who was on this Christian team guy chat I'd started up on Telegram, saw him, but we hadn't actually met. I just saw his picture, and I walk up to him like, are you the Josh Brimmer? And it's funny because he's like, crap, this could be a really bad, am I known for, what am I known for? Like, is this like old Josh or new Josh?
Right.
Because he used to be pretty bad about some stuff. So it was just a really good time, connect with all the guys, but it was great contracting. And you understand this because be in my nice little office off in our little Sealand office thing or whatever. I don't remember what they called those things, but walk in, hang out, talk to people, just do the stuff we do, right? Network and help out and do whatever with my job. And then the drama would start, be like, going to my office, boys, have fun.
That's right.
Just you know how that is, right? You don't have to be involved in it. Came back
Not
from
my
that.
problem anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Not my circus, not my monkey. Rolled back, ended up meeting a kid. So my wife, after I got back from Afghanistan, met this kid. I was going to do a metal band with him, and ended up not working out. Just kind of mentored him and discipled him kind of for about a month and a half because he'd just gotten clean, had moved to Clarksville to get away from where he was at. Randomly saw him at a O Sleeper Agony Scene show down in Nashville. He's like, Paul. I'm like, well, hadn't seen this dude, 8 years at that point. He said, my band's playing tonight. Then they invited me to a show in Clarksville. Talking to them, they were going on tour, asked me, hey, will you be our chaplain, like mentor us, disciple us? And I'm like, sure, let me talk to the wife, let me pray about it, and then I'll get back to you. So I go home, visit my parents, and I'm hanging out with their pastor, and he and I are just chilling, hanging out. We ended up going out up into the mountains, go hit some, hiking and stuff like that. And he said, hey, I want your thoughts on this video. It was Zoe Girl, who was an old Christian band, like 3 Chicks, I guess. I never really listened to them, but way back in the day. What was interesting is she was saying how they were playing a lot of churches, and we were sitting in a lot of churches, but in her struggle, in her faith and deconstruction for a little bit and stuff like that, she's like, we had nobody to disciple us. And I'm like, That's really interesting that you're showing me this video about a band saying how they didn't have anybody to mentor or disciple them. And I had a band just ask me to mentor and disciple them and travel with them. So I ended up going on the road with them, mentored them for about a year and a half. They got to play some really cool shows. They played with Spoken. They played with Brian Hedwalch from Korn. Did that. Ended up getting on TikTok, which was not my plan. Had this young soldier guy who was in the military I was mentoring through his divorce and discipling him. I was like, you need to get on TikTok, and you know us in social media.
That's right.
No, I don't do social media. I don't do TikTok.
We don't know how. That's the problem.
Well, we don't have our faces out. You know what I mean? Like, you don't
That's
want
right.
we're not these, and Scott Kinder does a really good job. He runs, he's a good buddy of mine. He runs DOL Coach, I think he's the CEO for Project Management Institute. So he built the soft PM course for guys like you and me,
Okay.
Green Berets.
Yeah.
He built a project management course where we can get our cert through him. And what's so great about it is we don't have to, it's not like study for a test, memorize all the answers, then write the answers down, right? It's a very much, let's talk through application. Let's talk your experiences, because for all of us, especially in these roles, we've done project management. We just don't have the lingo.
That's right.
Right. We can't think about, scope and, oh my goodness, I can't think of the darn word with, the people that are involved and who have a buy-in. I can't remember the name of the thing at this moment.
Investors or
It's not investors. It's
stakeholders?
Stakeholders.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, I needed that. Thank you. Stakeholders. All that stuff, right? We don't have that language, but we know how it works. We have an understanding. And then when you actually certify, you have to the test is an interview, and you have to talk through all these different scenarios and demonstrate your understanding of it and your ability to apply the principles rather than just take a test. So I really, really enjoyed that. But what he says is SEALs are whaling us in the fact that they're really good about getting out there publicly, what their capabilities are, even if, whether it's BS or not, right? But they know how to present themselves, and GBs suck at it. And we tend to be silent professionals and not quiet professionals, if that makes sense.
It does, actually. And like we were saying earlier, we've tried to hide from the social media just because we don't want our faces out there. We're generally traveling, and social media kind of passed us by a little bit. I would say during our careers, it was frowned upon in a lot of cases to have it. And they just didn't want people sitting there messing with social media because it was taking their minds out of the fight. I think more so than anything. It was a distraction, and it was seen as a distraction at first. And I think that was our era. We just didn't really use it. And that's,
Yeah.
when I say we don't know how, I mean, to communicate via social media is, it's a skill set.
Yeah. And also when depending on the missions you're on, you don't necessarily want your information out there.
That's right.
If you're running the rat missions, you don't necessarily want your face out there like, oh, hey, I know that guy. Some dude sitting in Iran, But so I got on TikTok, made a couple TikToks. One of them kind of blew up. And it was just an initial like, hey, this is kind of what happened with me and my wife on some things, and kind of a little bit of like the journey of suffering we've gone on a bit. And so I'm like, okay, maybe there is something here, God. Maybe you're wanting me here. And I ran out of data because I didn't have an unlimited plan because that was cheaper. And we lived in the county. Like, guess I can't do TikTok. And in 5 minutes, I had a text message from Verizon saying, thank you for your military service. We'd like to offer you a free upgrade to an unlimited plan. Like, oh, I guess I'm doing TikTok. Awesome.
I wonder whose plan that was.
Gee, I wonder. Well, I've tried to quit 2 more times. And both times, I was like, God, I think I'm going to be done with TikTok and just focus on Clarksville, focus on the stuff I'm doing here. My wife had my Charlie's ex-wife, who hadn't talked to her in 10 years, reached out to her on Facebook and was like, hey, I found Paul's TikTok, and I just want to say it's like, it's really helping me. It's really encouraging. I'm like, interesting. And then past December, same thing. I was like, I think I'm going to be done. And had another guy out of Maine reach out to me and like, hey man, we need you here. And given who he was, it was like, okay, because you've got a massive following. There's no reason you should be reaching out to little old me on this thing. So not that matters, but still, like, you know what I mean? And so ended up being pretty active on TikTok from a ministry-wise standpoint. Run a podcast on Fridays called Warriors Rising. I wrote a book called Onslaught of Ecclesia, which is kind of built like an AAR. And the whole purpose of that is like, hey, let's do an actual assessment of where we are as the church, as Christians. We kind of suck, but like not in a bad way, not saying it that directly, but like, hey, let's be honest about where we're at on things, right? Then from there, it's like, okay, if this is the issue, okay, what do we need to do? What's the mission? What are we called to? How do we walk that out? And I'm a big fan of the Spartans, clarity and brevity. Just, as because I hate those books, and you understand this. I'm sure anybody that listens understands this, and most of us do. You read through 30 pages, and then the last 3 paragraphs get to the point, and you're like, why did you not just say that? Like, you could have saved me all this other stuff.
It's called a bluff. Just do that.
Yeah, thank you. So basically just like, what are we called to? How do we walk it out? And then what are the consequences, not just here, but eternally for us as Christians if we do or don't, and the judgment we as Christians are going to face. Did that. And then I have people I meet and mentor. And so my last job was in 18 Zulu while I was in. And so I really approach things that way. So sometimes when I'm dealing with people, it's like, hey, you need to go talk to this guy. Hey, here's resources and materials I have here. Take it. That'll help you. Or like, hey, come with me. We're going to talk for a little bit, and I'm going to train you or mentor you in whatever way that ends up being, in whatever capacity, because everybody's different on what their needs are or what their goals are or where they're at in life. And then it's kind of like, all right, now boom, go do good things, and then check up on them. So do that. That's kind of the once over the world of Paul and my life. And it's a whole lot more in all those things. But yeah, that's kind of the 50,000 foot view.
That was a really good view, and there's a ton of things that I would love to talk about. The first thing that really stuck out. So you said your dad went in, joined the Army after 9/11, right? You were a junior in high school. So how old did that make your dad when he came back in and decided
he was in his 40s?
He was in his 40s.
I think he deployed when he was 45, if I remember.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then the family lineage that you guys that you glossed over really quick, unbelievable.
Yeah. So Uncle Vietnam, my grandfather was in the Korean War in the Navy. And it was really cool because he and my great uncle, his brother, were on the same ship, which was really, really cool. We've got World War II. We've got my great grandfather's. We've got his bayonet. We've got his dress sword. We've got his hat. His initial enlistment photo, his final photo, picture of him and his buddies, his awards that he wore, and his name stamp from the Civil War. So that's pretty cool. And then back beyond that, it's just like we just know about the one guy who was a medic, and so that's kind of all that.
That is unbelievable. Most people don't know beyond their grandfather, great grandfather. Any kind of stories into their great grandparents.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things we talk about every once in a while. It's like, how far does your name actually live on if you don't do something amazing?
Right. Walter Martin says, and this kind of goes into what I do now, but I really like what he says. He says, he who is not involved in the crisis of his time, of him it can be said he never truly lived. And I think that's there's a lot of wisdom in that, because people tend to, especially for us as Christians in the church, we tend to just kind of take a back seat. We sit back and we just, this is what I do. And, there's no real active role when it comes to what their responsibilities are and what they're called to. And then they kind of go through life. And I think this rolls over into SF guys and people leaving the military, and whether it be SEALs, Rangers, SOF, even just regular Army guys, right? There's that lack of purpose. And it's like, what is my mission? What am I supposed to do? I don't know how to do this. You know what I mean? And it really goes back to being overseas, where we know that comfortability breeds complacency, which breeds apathy, which gets people killed. And a lot of us tend to approach life like that. Now, obviously, when you're getting out of the military, one of the things is like the tools. Like, how do you actually transition? What does that look like? And so we get stuck, and I don't think it's necessarily a comfortability thing, but maybe it is, because I'm comfortable in this thing I'm doing, even though it's miserable and destroying me, but at least I have some level of control over it, even though it's absolutely killing me and everything around me. Does that make sense?
It does, and we've talked about it as being an identity a
Yeah.
bit, right? I mean, you go through, we bust our asses going through selection, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's regardless of how it was for each individual person. There was definitely parts of it that everybody had to question. All right, this does suck. Like
Yeah.
this is it, right? I remember for me it was on my birthday, and it was the last day of it was my last day of land nav because I ended up getting all my points, but it was miserable. It was ice storm, limbs are falling all around you, and I was questioning whether or not I was going to freeze to death.
Yeah.
It was a miserable time, right? It was November, December time frame, so it was cold out there in McCall, and you lived out there for a while, so you know the deal.
Yeah.
But we go through all those things. We beat ourselves up, blood, sweat, and tears, 100%, right? I mean, that's one job you can say you've cried, you've bled, and you've sweat over, like
Yeah.
absolutely. So to do that for such a long time, right? And I know you didn't get to full on, do your full 20, but for guys that do that, and I talked about it a little bit with on the last podcast. A lot of us, we spend more than half our life
Yeah.
doing that job. So to not identify with it, I think would be kind of hard pressed not to, not
Yeah.
to do. So I think for us, it's a huge loss, right? Because you're losing an identity and you're
Yeah.
losing a family as well, right? That's another
Yeah.
thing that you breed into this family. But I don't want to digress and
No, no,
take.
you're good. Well, I think that, because I came in as an X-ray, so my entire time was soft. I came in 05, I retired in 19. I mean, so that's, what is that? I can't do the math on that. So I had, 12 years, or that's, my math is wrong. 14 years
14 years,
in
yeah.
that community, and my last job was a Zulu. All I ever wanted to be was a Zulu. I
Right.
didn't care about Sergeant Major, didn't care about any of that, right? Like that was the peak goal for me, was to be a Zulu. And the hardest day for me was walking into my team room and telling my guy, even though I was as an op sergeant, my goal was to then take a team, and to then walk in and say, I will not be deploying with you guys anymore. Like that crushed me. That was hard. And it was, again, it's not even just my guys. It's the loss of the community. It's, as much as I really did try not to let it become an identity, because I saw the guys that really, because it's all they had, I saw what it did to them when they got out. But even no matter how much you try, it does become who you are in so many ways, because you have to live, eat, and breathe it for years. Like you said, you blood, sweat, and tears go for that goal to then get to where you really want to be able to do the mission sets you really want to do with the guys that you would want to work with and nobody else. So to lose that community, and really it's that people that just understand you, if that makes sense,
100%.
it's a loss of any type. You know what I mean? So that transition's so difficult, and they just suck at equipping guys for it. You know what I mean? They just preparing them for that.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it. You're around guys that you feel comfortable around all the time. And I think the reason we feel comfortable around them is because we gauge our mental health off of each other. For
Yeah.
one, we're all the same,
Yeah.
right? So if he's okay, I'm okay. And when we leave that team room and we go and start having other conversations or overhear other conversations, they're just a lot different than the ones
Yes.
that we have. And so you start finding things that you can talk about, right? Well, politics. Don't want to talk about politics.
Right.
Right. So you start trying to find these things that you see eye to eye on. And at the end of it all, it's still the same. We're still more alike than we are different.
Right.
Our similarities are such that my traumas may have come from before combat, but their traumas are so close to the same. It may have nothing to do with combat. It's trauma in
Right.
general, right? So it's just being human again, and looking back on that and saying, we don't need all these labels. Doesn't matter that you were a soldier. Doesn't matter what you did. It was, you have these traumas, and you're a human, and we need to talk.
Yeah.
We need to talk through this stuff.
Yeah.
And we need to understand each other better. I mean, if we're all walking the exact same path, then what is there to learn?
Yeah.
Right?
Very true. Everybody's got a piece of the pie, but nobody's got the whole pie. And the thing is too, I think that goes along with that, Steve, and you've read Gates of Fire, I'm sure. That's the book everybody loves. It's a great book. Stephen Pressfield, if there's one thing aside from it just being a very good, well-written book, the way he captures that camaraderie that is built into people through just mutual suffering and what that really brings about in the cohesiveness of a group of people. Because, even though, I've just met you, we've talked a little bit here and there, but like there's that idea like, hey, we've done the same things, we've suffered the same way, and there's just that mutual understanding of brotherhood that's built into that you can't it's not the same on the outside, and when I going from working with SF guys to working with musicians was, that's a massive shift, right? And even anybody on the outside, and it's not that they're less than, it's just they have a completely different life experience. Like they can't connect on the same way. It's this, I talk about it with my wife and I. She can connect with people that's been through cancer. I can connect with people that have been caregivers, but I can't connect the same way that she can. It was a lot of similarities. I did see a lot of similarities, just objectively looking on the outside of watching her go through that process and a deployment, just the way, kind of the mindset you have to have for survival and just understanding, hey, I could die any day. But there's that understanding, like and kind of it's coming to terms with it with yourself. Like, hey, I'm just not going to be able to connect with them in the same way, but just, it's going to be different, but it doesn't mean less than or worse. You know what I mean? But still, it is different, and it's hard to get used to that because you're, like you said, you gauge everything off of each other. It really does become your family, whether you like each other or not, right? And so that's to lose that is it's a loss. It's like a death in the family. It's terrible. I think one of my buddies, he was a chaplain, so he did a lot of research and stuff like that. And he was actually saying one of the things that they talked about in this one psych was talking to him on this training, that basically he was talking about losing somebody in the military and a buddy, and then also getting out abruptly. It can actually be on par as far as the stress, the loss. It's on par with losing a spouse. Recently, it was really interesting to see like what it did to, like what it does to people, like mentally, emotionally, all that stuff. And on compound all the traumas on top of that, it's like, well, how do you deal with this stuff? Because now I don't have people I can just be with, that I feel safe around, that I feel good with, that I know I can trust. I think Sebastian Munger talks about it in his book called Tribe, and then also in his talk Why Soldiers Miss War. It's not that people are worse. It's just like, you take an 18-year-old kid, you put him in this situation. It says, I don't like you necessarily, but I give my life for you, and I know I can trust you, and I know you, and you can trust me, and that's pretty solid. And then we're going to go through this stuff, some crazy stuff together. And then you get out in the world, you don't know who you can trust, you don't know who you can talk to, you don't know if they got your back, and so especially for younger guys getting out that have been through some crazy situations, that's a pretty massive shift that I don't even know how you would really prepare people for that, especially if you're just completely cut off from the military community or the soft community.
No, and that's that blows me away, that comparison to losing a spouse. But I guess I can see it. We were talking about it earlier. You retired and you pretty much stayed home, right?
Yeah.
So the guys that at least you were working with, they're still within arm's reach. You still got a bit of a community there, but
Yeah.
like you said, somebody that gets out, completely disconnects. Maybe they have to go back home where they haven't been for 20 years, something like that, or they just feel like they don't want to be around anybody anymore, and they disconnect and they go off the grid. And I worry about all those guys
Yeah.
equally, because I just think it hits us all at different times.
Yeah.
How was your transition? I mean, you got out. It sounded like you got a job pretty quickly, at least something.
It was about 8, 9 months later. So my whole situation, I guess I would go back to frame it for an understanding of how I've kind of viewed things and look at things. I was raised Christian, but my dad came out of Christian Science. My mom was a daughter of a Methodist minister, but he was very abusive, very abusive. So my parents raised us in church, but I became a Christian when I was very young, but I didn't really know, like, what do you do? Like, how does this work? Right? I want to be close to God, but like, what does that even look like? Is this even real? And I never really asked that so much from a standpoint of like doubting, just, I, how do you do this thing? Right. Uh, and obviously when you join the military, you know what we do. We have fun. And especially a young guy that's now going into SF, like I didn't do the cheating and stuff like that, but I drank a lot and just had fun. So went through all my rotations. We lost the kids, and I was just burned out. I was angry coming back from Afghanistan. I was actually in the process of getting out of the military. I was ACAPing after that trip because I was like, there's a whole lot of other things that goes on, and I mean it's the Legion, so I mean enough said, right? Yeah, like
Tough place.
love my guys. We won't talk about whatever else goes on there in leadership, but there's there you always knew the fifth group guys at schools because they were the ones with the smallest award rack.
That's right.
And so, um, but I was getting out. I was just tired. I was burned out. Had one of my ACAP meetings, and I woke up at 3 o'clock, and I had this overwhelming sense of dread about this meeting. Like, you cannot go to this meeting. So I'm like, okay, uh, maybe I'll go. And it just got worse and worse. And I finally was like, okay, I won't go. I was driving into work. And I was just crying. Like, I'm like, I don't know what to do. Well, let me back up. Coming home from Afghanistan, we got stuck in Afghanistan for 3 weeks. And they actually, to the point, like, they flew us out to Manis. And we're like, all right, we're going home finally. And I can't remember what company it was, but they were like, hey, that's our bird. And our pilots were like, no, these guys are on our manifest. And that captain or that major and sergeant major threw a big fit. They flew us back into country, dropped all of our stuff up at Bagram. The company sergeant major looked at us and said, don't worry, we'll take care of you. And we watched our plane fly away. And nobody knew we were back in country.
Oh wow.
It's just so we're like, okay, we're stuck again. And so me and my medic were just playing Battletoads and whatever on the emulator. And he asked me, hey, have you ever heard Learn the Bible in 24 Hours? I'm like, no. And so I was like, okay, let's listen to that. And it was literally just me hours and hours going, no freaking way. No freaking way. And I'm like, why have I never heard these things? Got back, just pounding beers and every night, angry. And I started just listening and doing some research. And then that happened with the ACAP stuff. And I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, and God kind of like punched me in the gut and was like, dude, like the military is your ministry. You've just been living for yourself. And that hurt real bad because like all the opportunities I looked at like just came flooding into my mind, including Reg before we lost him. And I was like, crap, I have failed at this. So when we went to SWIC, I was at my sister's wedding and I saw a commercial for St. Jude's Children's Hospital. And I just said, God, I want an opportunity to witness to people with cancer and their families. And my wife, at the same time, I didn't know it, was praying in her prayer journal. She asked God to use her, give her new testimonies. And 2 weeks later, she got diagnosed with leukemia. And the night prior, I couldn't sleep. And God said, look this dude up on YouTube. And it was like midnight. And it was a teaching called, if Jesus was your pastor, you probably wouldn't go to his church. And the whole thing was about counting the cost. Like, have you counted the cost he's basically like, have you counted the cost to follow Jesus? Have you counted the cost of doing ministry? And then she got diagnosed. So we recognized very quickly, okay, that was definitely an answer to prayer. And so we walked that out, did a lot of ministry. It was still very hard. Like couldn't be in the sun for 2 years. We couldn't have more kids. There was a whole host of things. She had real bad chemo brain. Just a lot. They thought she was going blind because of her graft versus host disease for a minute. Then when I got back, and this is getting into the transition question, so I know it's a long way of getting around to your point. So from that point in 12, when I was like, okay, the military is my ministry, I'm going to focus on this, share the gospel. I'm going to learn as much as I possibly can. And part of that was, the question I asked was, is this real and I can demonstrate it, or is it a load of BS and I can demonstrate it, right? Just what we do, right? If you're going to like run any intel thing, right? Let's look at all the objective facts and find it and throw it all down and let's see where it goes. And let's go with the data and intel, because like intel drives operations. So if I got bad intel, why am I going to continue in the operation? So I just went into tons of research on all things: liberal scholarship, conservative scholarship, historical, archaeological, all the evidence on all sides. So that really solidified me into, I basically got to a point like I'm more sure that Jesus is who he claimed to be and the Bible's true than I am my own name. Like if there's one thing I'm sure of, it's that. But so I was doing ministry in the military, and when I was a team sergeant, or when I was the ops sergeant, I should say, out at ATG, I was talking with the Muslims, like our counterparts, and I was witnessing to the guys when I could, and I'd run Sunday services and just be there for the guys as much as I could. But then I got home, and I just felt like I was done. Like I was done. I'm like, what do you mean I'm done? I've got 7 years left. My wife's worth 2.3 mil. Like, what the heck do you mean I'm done? I can't get out. Like, I'm in a contract. Like, so what ended up happening was for about 2 months I fought it. And every time I'd be like, I can't afford to get out, And every time the verse would come back to my mind, seek ye first my kingdom and my righteousness, and it's going to be okay. I'm like, yeah, but 7 more years and we'll do this thing. So then at Thanksgiving, we went to my wife's aunt's parents in Pleasant View. They were old gospel singers, and Henry was in World War II. That dude was just a wealth of knowledge and loved the Lord. And we were just sitting there talking. When he talked, I always loved to just listen to what he had to say. And out of nowhere, he just said, he was explaining when he was in the Imperials and he left and did the next thing. He's like, man, it was so good. I was like, why couldn't I have been doing this for these last however many years? And he looked at me and said, Paul, God's got a life for you outside the military. And it's going to be so good. You're going to be like, why couldn't I have been doing that? And I'm like, it's very interesting that you make that statement. So I'm now chewing on this, but continuing down, like, hey, 7 more years and then we'll go do whatever. And then I went down to North Carolina, visited my buddy who was in my bachelor's program, and he was retired Army, retired post office, real solid, just that old guy that's got a lot of wisdom. And we're sitting there just talking, and he said, Paul, you were meant to have an impact of some sort, but it may mean you don't finish out your career. And at that point, I'm like, okay, now I got 2 of you telling me this. So on my way back to to Tennessee from North Carolina the next day, I was like, all right, God, I'm done fighting. If you want me to stay in the military and keep doing ministry here, I'll do it. But if you want me out, I'm ready. I said, but you got to do it because I'm locked into this contract. And then the next day, the doc walked in from my MRI, and he's like, how are you walking? I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, I changed my gait a little bit. Like, I don't know. And then 3 weeks later, I was just absolutely frying from the seizures, and the doc walked in, diagnosed me, and he's like, we're medically retiring you. And I'm like, oh, guess that's an answer to the prayer. But then my mom was in the room with us, and of course, you got to do everything you can to embarrass your mom in that moment. So I looked at my wife. I said, well, I mean, the good news is we don't have to put quarters in the bed anymore. So I had a really good understanding, obviously, there. Like, I was done, and it wasn't just oh, hey, this is just a medical happenstance. This is 3 weeks after I asked God, like, hey, if you're going to have to get me out some way if you want me to do something else. And that cost us a lot. Plus I had real bad PTSD. You know, you have the normal PTSD just from all our rotations and all the explosions, all that fun stuff that we go through. The hyper, not the hyper focus, the
Vigilance.
hyper vigilance, all that stuff, right? Just getting sad, but then losing guys. But that last rotation in ATG, man, my poor medic, brand new 18 Delta, and it was like just kids, blown up kids, shot kids, uh, scorpion bites, and that was hard for me. One losing the two kids prior, even though they were pregnancies, like it's still like it's my kid. You see him on the screen and like you're just in love with him. And then the second one was hard because my wife had to carry it for a little bit after it had died, so that kind of sucked for a little bit. But so I could not hear kids cry at all. Like it rocked me, and I kept getting the nightmares. My we all get the fun ones, like like pulling the trigger, like please go down, like it's just not working, or something like that. But my nightmares that I would get was the kid would get hit, and I'd run over with him, and I'd be pulling over out my med pack, and it's my daughter, and like she's bleeding out, and she's like asking me not to, like, Dad, don't let me fall asleep, and it's like, I was like, okay, that rocked my world. And so that my PTSD was like just real bad from that, and then plus the seizures were throwing me into rages because I had a couple full on tonic-clonic seizures, but mine were all focal, but I was just having so many of them, and they would just get me into these rages where and so like I've got the PTSD plus that, and it was terrible. Then plus I'm trying to deal with like the loss of SF and my career and my guys, and like it's all just one big thing. And so even though I had purpose, it was very hard. And then dealing with like the different medications for the epilepsy, and they were changing them out every month. And so because the Great Army, with seizure meds, you can't change brands. Like once you find stuff that starts working, like you can't change it because they're not the same, especially generic brands. So I had one that I got on, and I was literally, I already struggled with like suicidal thoughts and stuff like that, and these, like, it was a physical fight not to just eat my Glock. Like, I mean, it was one day my wife walked in, and I had to feel the metal on my face. I was like, if I don't, I'm going, like, I have to do it. And so in that, though, that transition period, I did get EMDR, and anybody, like, I know there's tons of different treatments. You can talk to counselors. That does nothing, right? You're talking about your stuff. Actually looking into what EMDR does, eye movement dissociative response, part of the problem when it comes to the trauma, especially when you're dealing with compound trauma, is because of the way the brain works, right? You get in those fight or flight, you bypass everything in the processing to make the decisions. But by bypassing everything in the brain neurologically, your brain doesn't process it. That's why we get such visceral responses over time, especially when you compound. And so what EMDR does is and I would recommend it to everybody in our community. It honestly, it should be part of what we do when we come home. But what it does is it replicates REM sleep, and they do it with either lights, or for me, they had buzzers in each hand, and it would just go right hand, left hand, right hand, left hand. And so the way it works, you list out events, and like most intense to least intense. And you start on the least intense, and you do talk about like, hey, when I'm here, like this will trigger this type of response from me. So it's not just sitting there talking about your feelings all the time. You're actually like, what are your responses? What are your physical and emotional responses to whatever event? What memories do you have? And then obviously you rate them. And then what you do is they make you sit and you think, and with as much clarity in your mind as you can, you picture the event. And then they just say, go. And you just let your mind go. And then they start the buzzers or the lights. And it replicates REM sleep. Well, what's your brain doing in REM sleep? It's storing everything. It's processing. So what it's actually doing is it's going back to the memory, properly filing it so that your brain can properly process the trauma. And so what they found is if you can actually do that right after somebody's had a traumatic event, it won't hit the neural pathways in the same and get stored. And so that you don't have near the level of PTSD or stuff, reactions to it. So I did I had a great woman, a great therapist for that. She worked a lot with cops and with soldiers. And so we did a lot of sessions with that. And the best way I can describe it is these things that had such massive effects on me. So what happens is like the next 2 days, like you'll get really, really sad. And she's like, you're going to get sad, but it's your body actually grieving. It's your brain actually processing everything correctly. And then sometimes you have to do multiple times, and it's like peeling onion layers off. But by allowing yourself to actually process the memories correctly, it gets everything back to more normal stasis. And so like I might hear a kid cry and like I'll get sad and I'll have a bit of a reaction, but it's like it took the teeth out of everything. It's just so much less of a response.
That's unbelievable. So talking through that, so it has a lot to do with REM sleep, and actually processing it. So this is after the fact. You didn't necessarily process it while you were going through the event, and now your body's actually taking that, or your mind's actually taking the time to process it after the fact.
Yeah, well, that's what the therapy does. It replicates REM sleep. Because REM sleep is when your body is filing and storing and stuff like that. What that does is it replicates it, takes the memory, and I don't know how it works, but it does, where it basically, by thinking on the memory and just letting your mind go where it wants to go. And it's not like an hour of it, it's an hour of 45 to a minute long sessions. So they'll like, all right, think about the memory, go. And then your mind will go for 45 seconds to a minute. And they'll say, okay, what do you notice? And it could be a memory, it could be a feeling, it could be anything. And they're like, okay, just notice that, go. And then they'll just do that in 45 second to a minute increments. And then after so long, they'll be like, okay, think about the memory again. And what you'll notice is the memory, as far as the traumatic side, it's very weird. The best way, it kind of grays out, it kind of fades over time as you're doing it. And so then again, it's over the next couple of days, like your brain will just continue to process it and store it and kind of file everything correctly.
So then, are the nightmares pretty much gone now?
Yeah, I haven't had nightmares since with my daughter.
That's amazing.
It's, like it really. I still have certain things, like you never get rid of the hypervigilance. You never get used to, like you don't. There's certain things you're not going to get rid of, right? I think that's just goes along with everything we've done, right? But as far as some of those things, like I don't have the issues I had. Everybody deals with anger to some point. It did help with some of the loss on the losing, not being an SF anymore. But that's kind of goes back to what I was talking about with what helped me a lot was I had purpose. You know what I mean? And it's hard because you, like you said, like you live, you eat, you breathe, you train with a bunch of dudes, but you always have a mission. You always have purpose. And then you get out and it's like, okay, what is my purpose? Is it to sit behind a desk? What am I really doing? Because I think that's part of it too, is that you go from literally having effects on regions and people groups to I type a computer. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, it's de oppress, libera, right?
Yeah.
Free the oppressed. That's what you've been doing. So every day that you're going to work, you're moving towards that goal.
Yeah.
Right. And so again, you've got that thing in your sights. You know what you're doing, and you're committed to it. You know what you need to do. And so when you leave that, I think where we mess up a lot is we don't like to end chapters.
Yeah.
We think the chapter is just going to continue to go on. And what we need to realize is, hey, your retirement, that's all that is change the chapter. It doesn't matter if it ends great or if it ends bad. It's just the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
Turn the page and look at that next mission, like what you're talking about. And finding that next thing is everyone's struggle, I think. You seem to have, at least as you described it, you didn't have a choice.
Right.
You were on the path that you were supposed to be on, and you were getting guidance from the one source that it really matters.
Yeah. And and we all know guys that, especially on, like they're at the end of their career and they're trying to demonstrate they're still valid.
Right.
They burn out bad. You know what I mean? Because they're burning the candle at both ends to show, hey, I'm still valid. But like, there's a reason the Army song says the Army keeps rolling along, because it does.
Sure
And
does.
we're all just a cog in the wheel, and that thing's gonna move whether you're there or not. None of us are that important when it comes down to it, and we're all replaceable. You know, and so that's where having the understanding spiritually that, and it doesn't make it easy necessarily, but having that understanding, like there's so much something so much bigger than just the military, and having the understanding that, like, my mission set ultimately, right? Why am I in SF? Yes, I'm doing these things. I love them. I'm operating. I'm mentoring, as an op sergeant, even though, I had a bunch of new guys. So what's my job? Make sure that they're prepped and ready to go to the team when they go to the team. Make sure I'm getting them trained up in all the different things, their jobs, plus how to operate on a team. So I kick them out to the teams as much as I could so that they could get the experience, figure out what team they wanted to go to, build those relationships, and then also prep them for when they're in leadership as well, you know? But so coming out of that, I had that was important, but then, like, the ministry side of things, because dealing with eternal things, right? And so my mission didn't change, just the operational environment changed. There is that loss. You're not gonna get away from that, but how do you handle that? How do you walk through that process? And I think that that's where, the guys that I know, and granted it varies, but Tony Pryor, Tony Pryor, right? Silver Star, 4 dudes, bare hands, all that stuff, killed him, all that. Great dude. Like, Bucket's like I love Bucket. He's a great guy, and him and Marty Moore and Brad Fowers, Jake Tregeser, all these guys are great, solid dudes. And one of the things that I've noticed with them that we've all talked about is that part of the thing with as we've transitioned out, and talk to each other, is that purpose, that mission, and living for Christ, and what that actually looks like. And the thing is with that is our life was chaos before, in a sense, because there is a lot of variables and it's always changing. You never do the same mission set twice necessarily. Like, there's always, even if you do go to the same place, there's always going to be differences.
Sure.
And for us, having that purpose in a way that, and understanding, like, my mission is ministry, doesn't matter the operational environment, whether it's in SF or out with musicians or locally in Clarksville or on TikTok, there's still purpose. I'm still having an impact on people's lives, and that's, and that's where I go back to the Green Beret thing. Like, we have a lot to offer people through our experiences. We have a lot of life experience, even though I retired just at 35, I've been through a lot. Not that I'm anybody, but I know I can be value added, because, again, it's not about me. It's about me making sure everybody else has what they need in order to carry out their mission. And so as long as I can make sure they're equipped and they're taken care of in that aspect, I'm successful, and I think that that's a massive point to understand for us as Green Berets. When you look at UW and the phases, what do? We don't build soldiers, we're like, at least we do, but when you actually look at the phases of UW, we build cadre. Why do we build cadre? Because that's how you force multiply. Because if I train a nug to kick down a door, I got a guy who can kick down a door. But if I train him to train others, now I've got 10 nugs that can go do things. And I got these 10 nugs over here, but I just trained 2 people, and that's how I become, as Phil says, that's how we become cancer cells, and that's how we affect mass populations. But that's where, for me, understanding that there's something so much more and bigger than me that is going to have eternal consequences, that really is what matters. And then keeping my eyes on that, even in pain, and this is where it kind of goes back to, like, the church standard and where we are collectively as the body of Christ, or the church. We've been sold this junk bag of goods that life will be good and this and that, and then you read through the Bible and you're promised suffering, you're promised persecution, you're promised pain, and it's like, well, You ain't telling me that. And so then stuff starts to pinch, then you start to suffer, then stuff goes, and it's like, I was lied to. How do I handle this? But, I always think that if you're in that place, even if you're completely despondent, I think you're in good company, because even the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians that we despaired of life itself. They're talking about, like, basically, like, they were so defeated and so crushed with everything they were going through, like they wanted to die. Like that's the Apostle Paul, who wrote a mass portion of the New Testament. That's a pretty amazing statement by a guy like that, because we tend to think, in these little windows, like, oh man, they got it all together, things are good. It's like, no, dude, like, they struggled, they suffered, and we're promised that. And I think that that's, for me, it's like, when you realize that, it's like, oh, I know how to do that. I can suck and still thrive. Like, I was made for this type of thing. You know what I mean? But that's, I'm not downplaying what people go through, but what I do know is that when you understand what you were made for, and this goes back to what you talked about, identity, our identity being the suit, our identity being the beret. I'm going to talk right now with this one girl at a coffee shop, and she's like, we're talking about like suffering in life and bad things happening to good people and identity and all these things. And the fact of the matter is when you really break a lot of these things down, we identify with our desires. That's what we tend, because even being a Green Beret, that's a desire. I have a desire to be with these guys. That's my identity. Like, that's a thing, but it's going to go away. And ultimately, we were made to have our identity in Christ. And only that can truly satisfy. Only that's going to give you actual peace. And there's a difference between happiness and silence versus joy and peace. Because I can have happiness and no joy, and I can have silence and no peace. And that is a massive thing that if you don't have Christ, you're missing that. Because ultimately you were made to have your identity in him and be in relationship with the Lord. And then understanding from that standpoint, also you develop gratitude. Because when you understand, and I really understood this when I got back from Afghanistan, and having lost the pregnancies, because this guy framed it. We talk about the love of Jesus, right? Enduring the cross. And it was so much more than the cross, right? One of the things, we know that they beat him, they scourged him. There's a prophecy of the Messiah, so Jesus Christ in Greek, Christos, it means anointed one, Messiah. The Messiah is this person that was prophesied to come in the Old Testament. It kind of everything looks forward to that. And that's a big reason of why we can demonstrate that the Bible is true, that Jesus is who he claimed to be. But in Isaiah 52, which was written back in the 700s, 52:14 through 53, it says that his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. That's actually watered down. What it actually is saying is that he was so physically destroyed, he no longer appeared human. That is a massive level of suffering. And Isaiah 50 verse 6 tells, what we learned there is that part of his thing is they ripped his beard out. So he suffered, then took all the sins of the world on himself, and did all that in order to forgive us and bring us into relationship with the Father. But what we think about is that's pretty heavy, right? The love of Jesus. But what we don't think about sometimes, I think, is the love of the Father. And that's where it really rocked me, because it was like, I remember seeing my baby on the screen, and you hear the heartbeat, you're like in love with it at that moment. But then they're like, hey, you're going to lose the baby. Like, we don't know when, but you're going to lose it. And then them going back in, trying to find the heartbeat, us hearing nothing, like, it just like destroyed me. Dude, like anything I would have done to just, I'll trade places. I don't care. But yet, God in heaven watches as his son endures all this, is crushed, is destroyed, is crucified, as they mock him. And like, dude, as a dad watching my child go through it, I couldn't imagine, and then, but he doesn't intervene. Why? Because he understands this is what's required in order to be able to bring us into relationship with him. I mean, so when we think about love, like the love of the Father is massive to allow his son to endure that. And yet they both do it willingly. And so it's like, if I am going to, like, why would I withhold anything from a God who withheld nothing from me? And when you understand that depth of love, man, that is healing. That is healing. And even if you're in the most midst of your pain and just loss and who the heck am I? I'll tell you who you are. You can be a son. You can be a daughter. You know, that's the thing, is like, it's not just this, you're just some dude that serves the Lord. No, you can become a child of God, and you will have a father that truly loves you. He's not going to keep you from enduring pain and struggle, because ultimately, as we learn in the book of Job, like, you know, Job loses everything, right? He suffers, and he goes through this process of discourses and talking, and like finally he's like, I want an audience with God. And really the question is, why does God allow these things to happen? And ultimately God's answer is, look, you have to understand, like, I understand what I'm doing, and you have to trust me, because there's so much more going on that you're not even going to be able to understand. You couldn't plan out. But I'm trying, in those moments, like, I'm trying to teach you things. I'm trying to have you teach others. You're having an effect on people. They're having an effect on you. You know, I go back to my wife's cancer process, right? That was hard, you know, and for me, you know, and us and our personalities, it's like, dude, give me the cancer. Like, we'll rock this thing. Like, and even if I die, okay, cool. Like, I'm surprised I'm still here anyway with some of the things I've been through. But with that, my, you know, being in that position where it's like, I can't protect you. I can't help you. I can support you. I can encourage you, but you've got to walk this on your own. For me, that was incredibly difficult. But what I learned in that was I had to give my wife over to him and be like, dude, she's yours. Like, I I can't do anything. I have to give her to you and trust you with her. That's all I can do. And so there was a lot of him teaching me and her to die to ourselves and really lay our trust in him. And in that, our faith is strengthened. And people tend to make these stupid statements like, "All faith is, you know, no evidence." It's like, no, that's absolute bullcrap. Like, you have faith in that bridge because you know you can trust it, and you have evidence for that. And it was finding in those times of suffering the people we could minister to, the people we could have an effect on and be there for, but then also could be there for us. It was there was so much strategically, and you know, we all know this from a standpoint of like when you look at a mission and when you're affecting a region, all the third and fourth order effects that you have to think about, and then stuff starts to happen. You're like, oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't see that, but oh, that was good, or that sucked, you know. And yet God's in heaven going, look, I've got this. I'm maneuvering all these things in such a way, and there's consequences to things that we do on the negative side, you know, and he's going to let us hit those consequences, but then ultimately he can even take that and redeem that for better things, you know. And so that there was so much that we were able to do and experience and learn and grow because of that pain. And the thing is, we asked for it. We asked for it, right? We said, God, we want an opportunity to do this. And he gave it to us. And that's why I know God led me to that video, because it is like, count the cost. Count the cost of what this is actually going to mean that you've asked for, and to follow me and walk this through, because it's going to cost you. And that's why Jesus in Luke 14, he says that, like, count the cost. You want to be my disciple? Count the cost of what that actually means. You know what I mean? And then it cost me like my cognitive function for a while, you know? But again, it's like, there's so much that is going on, and people we've been able to affect in a positive way and reach for the Lord, or just encourage or love on, or have them love on us and give them opportunities to serve us, and then teach us to really be able to sit in the midst of it all and say, I don't understand, but I love you. And just when you don't even feel God, like, can you just worship him? You know, and again, it's not because like, oh, I just blind. It's because like he's demonstrated himself so faithful so many times. that like, even in the midst of this, I know you're listening and you hear me, and I know I'm still your son, and I know that there's, and so for me with that, with getting out to go to finally wrap this whole thing up, like that's the purpose. And if you don't have your identity in that, you're going to be constantly seeking that in some way from something. And ultimately we were made to worship. We were made to be sons and daughters of the Lord and serve him, because this life, dude, like we're getting older. Like it's like our career's already over. I feel like it should be like, dude, I'm still just, I feel like I should just be like getting to group. You know what I mean?
Right.
It went so fast. But like I'm already like hopefully just not quite halfway through my life, but we're all getting older and it's all going fast. And so what about after this life? And the recognition that everything we do here is going to have an eternal consequence, whether we like it or not. And that is what matters. And then loving him enough and loving everybody else enough to say, you know what? I love you enough that I'm going to represent him to you and love you and allow him to love you through me so that you can reach your purpose. And that's really where it comes down to. And I think why those of us that do go SF, and that understand the mission, right? That understand UW. Our desire wasn't just, I didn't want to go just kick doors down. That wasn't me. Like, and I always told my students, like, if you want to go kick doors down, take the long walk or go to Ranger Bat. You don't need to be here, because that's like this much of what we do. I wanted to have an effect on people. That's why I loved the UW mission before I went in. And I was fortunate. I'm very fortunate to have my uncle and my dad, talk to me and teach me these things when I was younger about what the different SF or SOF elements did. And so, that's the beauty of it. We're really equipped for that. And that's where we thrive, is seeing not ourselves be enriched and grow. And we like that, but ultimately we're filled, and we feel fulfilled by watching others grow and being not the dude that's up there, but the guy, that team sergeant that can stand in the back and watch his guys go do good things. That's and right. Watch them thrive. And that's where it's really at. And it doesn't mean that even coming out, like you're going to find that purpose instantaneously, because you're going to have healing that you need to go through. Again, I'm going to recommend EMDR to every freaking operator. They need to do it. Military guys, you got PTSD, you need to go get EMDR. But there is healing that has to take place. But again, understanding the mission is like, okay, these are things I have to do. I need to get better so that I can serve others, because I'm not done. God's not done with me. And I'm just going to say it straight out. Like, if you don't have Christ, like you're always going to be seeking identity in something, and it's going to leave you just right where you were, incomplete and empty. That's why the guy that leaves the suicide note in Vegas that says there are no answers here.
Wow. No, that's some excellent points. I mean, just you hit the nail on the head with so many different things. Where do you think we're sitting right now as a country with religion?
So, obviously, we are not a Christian nation. We're not a religious. Well, I would say we're starting to move towards spiritual. From the standpoint of seeking something, right? There's the hardcore new atheists. That time's kind of over, and people are really starting to move towards like, maybe there is something more out there. That's why we see the more, and again, me from a Christian standpoint, I'm looking at it from a spiritual warfare standpoint, because if God is real, then all the other stuff is real too. You got the benevolent and the malevolent. You got the Lord, you got the enemy, and he's got a plan too, right? And that's one of the things that we also doesn't get talked about much is spiritual warfare. And you know this. You can have the best laid con op. You could brief that thing, get all the stuff. As soon as you leave that gate, the enemy gets a say.
That's right. And
he can come through other people. He can, but so spiritually, with that, one thing Dr. Chuck Missler says is, and he did a lot of black side contracting. He was in like the corporate world. His company he owned did the electronics on the B-2 when it was a compartmentalized project. and I believe it was the B2. But he always said something very interesting, and his background was mathematics and information sciences. He said it's always interesting to see when people reject God, the things they'll start to embrace and they will believe in. And so I think that's where we're kind of heading now, spiritually, is that people do feel, again, we're built to worship. We're built to have a relationship. And in this, like, well, so we're just a cosmic accident, which violates all science and physics anyway. Like, they are now, well, maybe there is more. And so, like, now we see, if I'm the enemy, what I'm going to do. Well, I'm going to start implementing things and maneuvering and influencing people to start to give you access to the spiritual stuff, even though you don't think it's spiritual. That's why I think that there's such a push towards, like, all the hallucinogenics now and these DMT trips and all that. Like, there's a reason that these ancient cultures would talk to their gods or get wisdom from entities by using hallucinogenics, because it pokes your head into a world that you are not supposed to be in. And when you go seeking, they will answer back. Like, I can tell you that 100%. And anybody that doesn't think that the whole demonic angelic realm isn't real, like, play around with it for a little bit. You're going to find out real fast, especially if you start opposing it. That's when you're really going to find out. And so spiritually, and as far as the country goes, you know, we're moving some pretty negative directions, but there's always hope. But as the church too, though, so the latest surveys, only 41% of pastors hold a biblical worldview. And so basically what they ask all these pastors a bunch of questions. What's your view on God? What's your view on life? What's your view on sin? What's your view on salvation? What's your view on Jesus? What's your view on being born again? It was a whole list of, like, as laid out very specifically in the Bible. Do you agree with this? And only 41% of the pastors agreed. It was 43% of head pastors, 27% of associate pastors, and 12% of teaching and youth pastors held biblical worldview. And then last year they came out with one that there was, while 68% of all the Americans polled said that they were Christian, only 33% said that they were born again, that they had believed in Jesus, trusted him for salvation. And then only 6% held a biblical worldview and said that the Bible influenced their life. So just from a standpoint of religion or Christianity or anything like that, like, we're not in a good spot. People are moving spiritually, but again, we have to look at where we're at in history, right? And this is where I'm going to again go to what the Bible states. So back in the book of Daniel, Israel is captive in Babylon in the 500s BC, and Daniel gets a vision. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and then Daniel gets a vision. Daniel 2 is the interpretation of the dream. Daniel 7 is the message that Daniel got. And it basically lays all history out, all of Gentile history out. And that's everybody. Gentile is everybody that's not Israel or a Jew. And it says, when you put them together, it says we go from Babylon to Persia to Greece. And then this fourth empire, it's going to be very strong, united, but then it's going to divide into two. Well, that happened in the 300s, or the Valentinius, I believe it was. We went to an east-west balance of power with Rome and Constantinople, I believe it was. And we've really had that east-west balance of power since the 300s. But then it says we go to a global system. And it's funny because people are like, oh, what's all this talk about globalism and a global system? It's like, well, I mean, he's been right so far. Like, why? I don't think he's going to continue to be wrong. And so it says we move to a global system that then divides into 10 regions. And, you know, that can all happen in a blink. And then with that, an 11th person arises. And that's a whole nother topic of discussion about who that is. So basically, as the Bible lays it out, we go, basically the world just kind of gets worse, right? And so for me, as I look at the world, I look at what's going on in Israel, because that's also very massive when you look at what's been stated is going to occur, because no nation in the history of the world has ever been decimated, scattered throughout the world, to then be brought back into their own land until 1948. But what's interesting is even in the church throughout history in the last 2,000 years, people that said that held a literal interpretation said, hey, this says this is going to happen. Israel is going to be a nation again, and they're going to have Jerusalem back. And at some point, they're going to have a standing temple. Even the church mocked them, and they were outcast because they said, never going to happen. The churches knew Israel. Like, they held all these different interpretations, but they had an understanding like this is impossible. And the Jews are very, very, actually, when you look at the number of Jews in the world, it's incredibly small compared to pretty much all other populations. But again, he says, like in the Old Testament, he says, I'm going to bring Israel back into the land. They're going to have Jerusalem, and there's going to be a temple. Now, it doesn't state that absolutely directly. I mean, he does say, I'm going to bring you back in the land. But there's, as he's talking through different things, like basically this is what it definitely, like these are the requirements you can pull out of it saying. And so 1948 happened, and then 1967 happened, and then they've got basically everybody's trained up. They've got all the pieces pretty much. They've got the red heifer for cleansing, for ritual cleansing. And from what I was told, because I went over there and I've got people that do a lot of work over there, that basically the way they've got the temple set up now, even though it's not set up, but they have it kind of like a Lego set where they can just boop, it's right up. So, as I'm not saying it's the end of the world, because things still there are certain things that need to happen and go into place, but like we're not heading in a good direction, and we're going to continue down that path. And when you look at our nation, what's interesting is when you read Romans 1, God lays out this whole list of judgments, okay, and basically the state of man, and what it is basically a judgment that God lays out on a nation and a people that denies his existence as the creator. They don't deny him. It's very interesting. The wording is they deny him as the creator. And so what he does is he basically says, I give you over. I give them over to a debased mindset. And basically he's like, you don't want to acknowledge me? You don't want to acknowledge me as a creator? You want to be evil? Oh, you're going to be evil. I will give you to that. And you're going to see how evil you actually get. And so when we look at our nation and all the stuff with the transgender, the stuff with the kids, the trafficking, abortion, and I consider abortion child sacrifice, straight up. Like whether you agree to it or not, that's what it is. Like we murder. We've gotten so technologically advanced. We don't offer our children on the fires of Moloch. We kill them in the body, in the Holy of Holies of the body. Like, we are an evil, evil nation, and we output so much filth and junk that just destroys people's lives. And then when we look at our nation, what's interesting is in Psalm 106 or 116, I can't remember, but he talks about Israel. He talks to them about you're offering your children, you're sacrificing your children to demons. That's what he says that to them. And then he says, those who hate you rule over you. And it's interesting because you see this tie because our politicians really don't like us. They hate us. Like when you actually hear them talk and they'll close doors, they don't respect the common man. But it's interesting to see all these patterns of these nations and Israel and where they were spiritually before massive stuff happened that was not good. And we are just hopping down that line like it's going out of style. And so I think for us as a nation, religiously, spiritually, we're not in a good place. The church is not in a good place. But that's where I think, that's just being honest. But for us as Christians, it's it's time to get serious. It's time to get serious about what we're actually called to. This whole sit on the back bench and don't be active in your faith. Don't know what the Bible says. Don't know who God is. You may have it's more we've got this acquaintance who we friended on Instagram. That's most Christians' relationship with God. And Walter Martin always says those who walk around in a war like there is no war are called casualties. And that's how most of us live as Christians. And it's no, we need to ruck up and we need to move forward. And whether you're in the military, transitioning out of the military, get out of the military, Like, you have a purpose, you have a mission, but you need to get serious about it. Because even if the end of the world isn't coming for another 1,000 years, doesn't really matter. None of us are promised tomorrow. None of us. And then we stand before him. And it's like, what have you done? What did you do for me? You know, we already know the fate of those that don't know God, that don't know Jesus, right? Eternal separation. That's pretty horrific. But for us as Christians, we have a judgment we're going to stand before. Like, very clearly, Paul says, we will all stand before the bema seat of Christ. And in 1 Corinthians 3, he describes that all of us, we've got the foundation, which is Christ, and each of us builds on that: wood, hay, straw, gold, silver, and precious stones. So we've got combustible and non-combustible, and fire is going to be put to it. And everything that we've built on that, whatever remains, is our inheritance. You know, I don't think that's going to be a painless thing. You know, because we tend to think, oh, we'll be in heaven. It's like, no, not all Christians are equal. We are going to have a judgment. We have an inheritance to gain or lose. Paul even says, like, look, I beat my body and bring it into subjection so that after I've preached to other, I myself am not disqualified. And the word is adokimos in the Greek. And what it means is it's used of metals that don't withstand the test. So, because they would test metals, right? And then in Luke 19, when we see the parable of the minas, we have the master, or I can't remember if it's the king or the master or the prince, but he has his citizens that refuse to have him rule over them, and that would be Israel. And then he has his servants, and right now that would be the church. And when he returns, he comes, right? He takes those 3 servants, and the one guy says, all right, you were faithful with the 10, you're responsible for 10 cities. You with the 5, you're responsible for 5 cities. You didn't do anything. Take his stuff and give it to the guy with 10. And then he says he's going to cast them out. Now, I don't think that's a loss of salvation, but I do think that in the Messianic kingdom, when that's established, what we learn as we study is, like, you're going to have people that are kind of like refugee status, and those that are actually in some capacity given responsibility. But it's all based on what we did here. And so that is a massive, massive thing. And in Acts 20, Paul makes an interesting statement. He's going to Rome, and he says to the Ephesian elders, like the people that he knew, he loved them, right? They're crying with each other because, like, they're not going to see each other again. They know it. And he says, I am free from the blood of all men, because I have not ceased and I have not withheld teaching you the whole counsel of God. That's an interesting statement that he makes, that I'm free from the blood of all men. Because when he said that, he was consenting to the stoning of Stephen. It says he made havoc of the church, so he was seeing people killed and stoned and put in prison. So what does this mean? He's actually referencing back in Ezekiel, where God tells Ezekiel to warn the people. And he says, if I say to the wicked man, you will die in your wicked ways, and you do not warn him, I will require his blood of you. And so what we learn there is that God is going to require the blood of the unsaved at the hands of the saved if we don't warn them and tell them the truth. You know, it's up to God or it's up to them whether or not they respond positively or negatively. But the fact of the matter is, like, we will be held responsible. And I don't understand fully what capacity that is. I don't think it's going to be fun necessarily, you know, but that's a pretty massive thing to think about, that God's going to hold us accountable for what we didn't do. And that's where it really hit me hard. And when I got back from Afghanistan, and all that stuff came flooding back to me, because I thought of Reg, because I love the dude. You know, we had a great relationship. We were all very close with him. He was just a good dude. And I realized for that 4 months I had him, I never witnessed to him. And again, it's like, it's between those people, whether they're going to respond positively or not. But I didn't even offer it to him. I you know what I mean? I didn't give him what he needed. And, you know, I'm not responsible for conversion. Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God provides the increase. But so he that plants and he that waters is nothing. But each receives a reward based on what they allow the Spirit to do through them. But it's like, Penn Jillette said it best. He's like, if you truly believe that if I don't believe in Jesus, then I'm going to spend an eternity apart from God. Whether you believe in like complete utter destruction of the soul and you just cease to exist, or you go on suffering forever, doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is it's eternal, and it's not with God, and it's pretty terrible. Like he said, how much do you have to hate me? Like how much hate do you have to have for a person if you truly believe that and you don't tell them? That right there, I think is the thing. Is we live in a world where the here and now is all that matters, and we're very short sighted, and we talk as if we understand or believe in eternal things, and live like today is all that is. And that's the sad part, because you miss out on so many things. My wife and I have gone through a lot, but I wouldn't give up a minute of it because of who we are today in the Lord, who we are as a wife and a husband. And it's been hard. Like we went to marriage counseling, we went to a Christian psych, and just because of everything we've gone through, of like her being a patient and me being a caregiver, and then me being a patient, her giving a caregiver, and how do we maneuver this and everything else that we've gone through with all the hurts and stuff. And, we were still doing ministry, but like coming together, and, but we would not be who we are today. We wouldn't be able to help people the way that we do if we hadn't walked those things. And so if my suffering and the things that I endured allow me to do that for somebody else, like I'll pay it 1,000 times over, and I think it's interesting because, when we look at special operations, what are we saying? Send me to the hardest places to do the hardest job in the most miserable way possible, and I'm going to love it. Why? Because we understand we're having an effect, and it's no different, And so for me, I look at it not as God, why, but thank you. Like you honor me. Like you thought that my family and I were worthy enough and strong enough to be able and to endure these things so that we can have an effect on people we would never have otherwise met and love them in a way that they needed so badly.
That's right.
And so that's kind of
the way that you guys view these, what I would call traumas. You view them as answered prayers. I don't think many people out there would view them that way. It's most people, something happens and it's, the sky's falling and it's just the worst thing ever. But your wife and you look at them and you see opportunity and you see them as a gift. That's just amazing to me. You said you grew up somewhat religious, but it wasn't until, was the turn for you, did it seem to be when you understand the Bible in 24 hours? Was that where things started sinking in, or you were already seeking that spiritual path before?
Yeah.
How did you get started with it
Yeah, so I wasn't seeking at the time because, again, I was coming home from Afghanistan. I was,
losing it up?
Yeah, and they called me Angry Paul because, man, I was angry. And again, I didn't realize I was having seizures, so that didn't help. But I was angry, and yeah, so listen to Learn the Bible 24 hours, and that's where I was like, well, no way. And then I again got back and I threw on I got another one of this guy's commentaries, and I was just listening to it, and that's when I really started to do the research. And it was one of the things he said was he framed it from that perspective of the father, and coming off right at the end of that trip, having lost the kids, that's when it really hit hard. And so that was the turn, and that's when I started doing the research, and it was just like there's no way. Like Psalm 22, written by David, 1000 BC, it says, my tongue clings to the roof of my mouth. I am dried up like a piece of pottery. My bones are all pulled out of joint. My heart melts like wax within me. Many dogs have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encompassed me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. They stand around and gawk, and they cast lots for my garments. I'm like, well, wait a second. Okay. severe dehydration. My tongue cleaves through my mouth. My bones are out of joint. My heart is melted like wax within me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. Okay, so crucifixion, obviously nails are used. You're severely dehydrated. The arms become elongated because the muscles can't hold it, so they get pulled out of joint. That puts a vector tension on the chest, which causes the heart to then work really hard to try to pump oxygen because you can't get the breath in, which then causes your chest cavity to fill with fluid. And what ultimately happens, either you suffocate, your heart ruptures, or you just go into cardiac arrest. Well, there's a problem with this. One, it's 1000 BC. Crucifixion's not invented for another 400 years by the Persians. Second, capital punishment in Israel was not crucifixion, it was stoning. So how could David have written this in 1000 BC, speaking about this event from a first-person perspective? Now, what's interesting is that Psalm 22 opens up with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, the verses were not added, and the chapters were not added till the 12th century. So the way they would reference passages was through the opening line or of the opening of the verse or whatever. So when it's recorded in the Gospels and Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? First century Jews, all of their minds would have gone straight to Psalm 22 instantly. And he's saying, this is what it is. Now, what's interesting too is he says, they cast lots for my garments. What was common practice for the Roman executioners where they could take the clothing of the executed? Again, how could David have known this? How could David have known that this was going to be a common practice? You know what I mean? It's impossible. But verse 27, it's interesting. It says, all the world will remember and turn to the Lord. That's a pretty amazing statement because when you talk about this, now we have a description, first-person perspective of a person dying by crucifixion, what occurs at the foot of the cross by the executioners. It then says all the world's going to remember and turn to the Lord. All the world's going to remember this event. You have Daniel 9. Daniel's in Babylon, and he's realizing the captivity is almost over. The 70 years based on Jeremiah. And so he goes to prayer, and he starts confessing the sins of the nation. And because one of the things that, as you study the Old Testament, like Jeremiah, Zechariah 12 through 14, Hosea 5:15, in order for the Messiah to come and establish the kingdom, Israel as a nation has to acknowledge some sin. And so he's repenting for the nation, thinking the Messianic kingdom is about to be established. That's when Gabriel shows up and he does this little play on words. He's like, it's not 70 years. He doesn't say that, but he says 77s are appointed for your people. And so we know that the context is years, 77s of years or 490 years, because Daniel was thinking 70 years. And that's where the play on words comes from. And so he's like 77s of years for your people, that's Israel, the Jews, and for your holy city, that's Jerusalem, to finish a transgression, to make an end of sins, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, or complete vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy, which would be the Holy of Holies within the temple. And then he states, know therefore and understand from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, will be 69 sevens. So 483 years. So we have a time marker there. It says from the command to rebuild the city after the Babylonian captivity, that starts to mark. Exactly 483 years later, the Messiah will present himself. And the biblical calendar is a 360-day calendar. So what it's saying is 173,880 days from that command is when the Messiah is going to present himself. And when you actually read Nehemiah 2, when Nehemiah got the decree to rebuild in the month of Nisan, to when Jesus entered in on the donkey, which is fulfilling Zechariah 9:9, which was written in the 400s, it says, behold, your king comes to you. He is just and having salvation, riding upon a donkey, upon a colt the foal of a donkey. Well, John 12 tells us that occurred 5 days before Passover, on the 10th of Nisan. Well, what ends up happening is when you look at the dates, 446 BC, and I don't remember the exact date, I've got it written down, to 10th of Nisan, 31 AD, is exactly 173,880 days to the day. But here's what's interesting. It says this many. It says after that, the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself, or have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So here you have a prophecy stating, and this is in the 5th century BC, when the Messiah will come, he's going to be killed. And after he's killed, the city is going to be destroyed. Well, Jesus came. He was killed. And then in 70 AD, the Romans laid siege to the sanctuary and the city, just completely laid waste to it. And then we had the mass dispersion. And yet Daniel wrote this in the 500s. Zechariah 11, 12, and 13 says, it's speaking of a shepherd that's going to be rejected. And so he says, name me my price, the princely price that I was prized of them. So I named for me my price 30 pieces of silver. And said, cast it to the potter in the house of the Lord, the price that they gave me. So here we have how much the shepherd's going to be rejected for, 30 pieces of silver. The money's going to be thrown into the temple, which Judas did. And then the potter's going to end up with the money. And the Pharisees, being good financially, said, well, we can't use this because it's blood money, but we're responsible for bearing foreigners in the land. So we're going to go buy a potter's field. And so, again, 4 centuries before Christ, you have how much he's going to be betrayed for, how much the betrayal price is, the money's going to be thrown in the temple, and who's going to end up with the money. And these are all over the place. But the problem is you have multiple authors separated by time and distance all writing on these things. And so as I was studying and researching, I came across all different types of scholarship. And the thing was, I could tell what was bunk, what wasn't. Fortunately, and that was one thing I get on this one guy on TikTok with, because his PhD's in this stuff on the liberal side, and this dude's invested his whole life. You don't like it when some little Green Beret who approaches things from an intel side, actually looking at the stuff from an objective standpoint as possible, comes along and starts crushing that soul. And so, there's all these things. There's structurings under the text. Mark, the last 12 verses of Mark. There's a guy, Ivan Panin. He was a mathematician out of Russia. Went to Harvard, I believe it was. And he started noticing patterns, mathematical patterns in very tight sections within the text of Scripture. And what's interesting, I'm one of these, I believe that God not only tells things what's going to occur, but he also preps for false teachings. And so there's a question of, should the last 12 verses of Mark be there due to the Alexandrian codices? And there's a whole thing within textual criticism. And again, me being that, right, I go into this stuff. I'm like researching all the data. I'm like, I hear what you're saying about these couple of Greek documents, but all the external, internal evidence points to the Byzantine and majority text. That's a whole nother conversation. But in those two documents, they don't have the last 12 verses of Mark. But the last 12 verses of Mark in the Greek, it's not huge, but there's over, if I remember correctly, 35 different things in the Greek. Vowels, consonants, I believe it's like number of the names. Like there's each Greek word has a mathematical number attached to it. But there's over 35 things evenly divisible by 7 in that last 12 verses. Now, and the chance of that happening is one with like a stupid number of zeros. And that's by chance. Thing is, that happens again in the genealogy of Matthew. Well, now I've got two things. I've got two different authors that are doing this now. This is impossible. And so even structuring within the text it's a mathematical impossibility. Genesis 1:1 does the same thing. Wow. I mean, and so you're talking, I know I'm kind of giving a very quick summary on some of these things, but these things add up, and there's thousands of them all throughout the text. Impossibilities in the structurings that if one letter is ever changed, everything on top falls apart and everything underneath the text falls apart. You're talking a level of design that no man could make. And you can't, and yet it's one thing for one person to do it again, But you're talking multiple authors doing this. Like, this is not possible by human hands. And so that's why I say, after all this, and then, pointing to things like the world and Israel and all these other impossibilities, it's like, I am more sure that the Bible is true and Jesus is who he claimed to be than I am my own name. But if this is true, then what it tells me about eternity is true. What it tells me about who I am is true. What it tells me about what I'm called to is true. And, Pilate asked Jesus a very interesting question. He says, what is truth? And truth was standing before him. If you have truth, like in a world of questions, and you actually find truth, you will do anything to hold on to that, because it's the one thing that is solid.
That's right. I like how you left that. That was a really solid point there, Paul. And yeah, you did. You glossed over a lot of stuff. But for the audience listening at home, where do they go and find all this stuff? Because you've got over 70 episodes on your podcast now. How do they find that?
So my podcast is called Warriors Rising. The whole point of that is just to encourage believers to get serious. So it's Warriors Rising. I'm on TikTok Theologic. Chuck Missler has learned the Bible in 24 hours. He hits on, some of these things, and it's cool because his background is mathematics and information sciences. So he goes at the text. I'm actually building a through the Bible training now to teach people through the whole Bible and start equipping them on that stuff. So I'm going to be doing that.
How's that going to work?
In what way?
So you said basically it's
yeah.
Like
So basically it's a summary of the entire Bible. The way it's going to run is an intro with just general it's kind of state of things, what we're going to cover, rules of biblical interpretation, the scope of the world, the scope of scholarship. Again, nothing crazy in depth, just so people have a good understanding of what's going on. Because it is an adventure, and it's kind of inviting them to an adventure. The second, third session are going to be on the prophecies of the Messiah. There's two types of prophecy. There is, there's four that the Jews saw, 4 levels, but really the best way I can describe it, just in summary, is you've got direct prediction fulfillment, like we talked about, but you also have a midrash, or seeing types and foreshadowings in the Bible. So example, right? What's the whole message of the gospel? Christ died for our sins according to the scripture. He was buried. He rose the third day according to the scripture. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4. And the gospel. So that's the biblical definition of the gospel. So when everybody asks, what's the gospel? Right there. Well, one of the things, though, is that scriptures at that time were the Old Testament. So that means the death of the Messiah and being dead for 3 days are also there. Now, Jesus, we can point to Jonah, right? Jesus even says in Matthew 12:40, right? As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. Well, one of the things that we learn, if you actually pay attention to the details, most people miss it, but Jonah died. He says, out of Sheol I cried. Sheol is the abode of the dead. We learn about that, and we get a view of that in Luke 16. And he says, I went down to the base of the mountains, and bars closed around me. And then there's other passages, but one thing we learn is that Sheol is actually at the center of the earth, according to the Bible. So he was dead 3 days, 3 nights. That would be a type. The second one that's really interesting, Genesis 22, right? And even skeptics would be like, why did God tell Abraham to sacrifice his son? That's terrible. Not if you understand what God's actually doing. What's interesting is he's setting up a model. He says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go and sacrifice in the place I will show you. So the first time the word love appears in Scripture is when a father is going to offer his son. And so he says he takes the men, they travel for 3 days, they go through the process, and Isaac says, hey, where's the wood? He says, God will provide. Well, and it says they went together. Isaac was a willing participant. That's kind of crazy to think about. He was probably about 30 when he did this. So you have almost a mirroring, because even Jesus said, if possible, if there's any other way, let's do that. But not my will be done, but yours be done. And so we have a son kind of doing the same thing. Not my will be done, but yours be done. I'll go along with this. So they go through the process. He goes to kill him, and the angel stops him. And then they see the ram, and they sacrifice that. Now, this is very interesting. How long was Isaac technically dead? I mean, he's dead from the time the command came. Well, how long did it take him to go through the process and get there? 3 days. So the son was technically dead for 3 days. And then it says Abraham returned to his men, and they went down off the mountain. It doesn't say Isaac went. Now, we know Isaac went, but the next group of chapters, an unnamed servant is told to go out and find a bride for the son. And the son is not seen again until he's united with his bride. So here in Genesis 22 through 24, you have the entire gospel message, the work of the Holy Spirit and the church, right there in the Torah. The death, a father offering his son, the first time the word love appears, he's dead for 3 days, then he's unseen while the Spirit goes out, finds a bride. He gives her gifts, and then the son will be seen when he's united with his bride. That's Genesis 22. Like, this is not New Testament, you know. We talked about Israel. One of the things that people talk about the second coming and this and that, they're completely missing what the Bible actually says about the second coming, and that goes to what Daniel was doing. Daniel was praying, right? Confessing the sins of the nation. Hosea 5:15 says, "I will go and return to my place until they acknowledge their offense. In their affliction, they will earnestly seek me." Well, for God to return to his place means he'd had to have left it. When did he technically leave his place? He left it at the incarnation. He says, "I will return to my place until they acknowledge their offense," singular. What was the offense of Israel? They rejected Jesus as their Messiah. So he's saying, I'm going to return there until you as a nation acknowledge me and petition me to come. And also Zechariah, Jeremiah. So basically the prerequisite condition for the second coming of Christ is that Israel has to acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah, repent of their rejection, petition his return. There's a whole host of another discussion on what that's actually going to take to do that. It's going to be pretty terrible. But because they're going to basically beg him to come back and save them. But that's why Jesus says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" But Moses striking the rock, we're all familiar with this story. Kind of a strange thing. Strikes the rock, water comes out. But the second time he tells him to talk to the rock. Well, this is interesting. Why? Why is he even here? What's the point? Well, 1 Corinthians 10, and as you study the rock, like we in Daniel 7, again, talking about the kingdoms, ultimately what comes down is a rock cut without hands that comes down, breaks the kingdoms, and then sets up his own. And so the rock is a representation of Christ, of the Messiah, typologically. And Paul says in Romans, the rock that followed them in the desert was Christ. Well, if Moses struck the rock the second time, he didn't talk to it. And he got put in the penalty box. He wasn't allowed to go in the promised land for misrepresenting God. And so one of the things that he did was he broke the model. Had he been obedient, he would have set up a type and a pattern for both comings. The first time, the Messiah is struck down. The second time, he comes by petition and being talked to. Same with the brass serpent in Numbers 14, or 21, sorry. Really strange thing. People are getting bitten by serpents. Make a brass serpent, put it up on a pole. Anybody who looks to it saved. Well, brass is used on altars because it can withstand fire. So you have judgment. And then the serpent represents sin. So anybody that looked to that would see sin judged. It's not explained anywhere in the New Testament or anywhere in the Old Testament until Jesus with Nicodemus. He says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." And anybody that looks to him is going to be saved. So you don't just have like direct prophecies. You have these patterns set up that, again, there's no way they could have known. Jesus hadn't come yet. Some of these prophecies weren't even made. So how could they have known?
It's amazing, man. Just amazing.
So that's why I say I'm more sure that Jesus is who he claimed to be, and the Bible is true, that I am my own name.
You got chills, brother.
It's exciting stuff, man.
It is.
But anyway, so to go back, that's on that course. That's like the second and third session is going to be on the Messiah. We're going to do those prophecies, and then we'll do the Midrash prophecies because there's way more of them. Then we'll go through the covenants, because if you understand the covenants, you're going to understand what's going on in the Bible, and you're going to also understand what's going on in the world and with Israel. And then we'll go Genesis to Revelation in 6 months, a year, and just wave tops, so that basically to equip people so that they have a capability to start on their own adventure,
Right.
and be able to navigate the whole and have a good grasp, so they know how to actually start going through, because it is an adventure. It is fun. I heard one guy say, why does God make it like this? It's like, because he's a fun God. Like, it's fun to data mine, man. Like, it's fun to see all the pieces fall together, and it's how we get to know him.
I think for a lot of people, just really getting started is the hard part, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I was kind of alluding to earlier with, what really got you started and going, and then now that you've spent so much time with it and so much time in the Word and studying, where would you recommend people to begin?
So, I mean, if you're a Christian, obviously, if you're not a Christian, obviously you'd be like, you need to know Jesus. Like, you need to trust in him, like, for salvation, right? Believe on the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. Acts 16:31. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. In the Greek, it's not speaking of degree. For God so loved the world. It's saying, the word is utos, in this manner, in this way, God loved the world, that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. And so, you have a God in heaven who loves you and desires fellowship with you and a relationship with you. And we've all sinned, right? We've all done something. We've lied. We've broken God's law in some way. And therefore, even if we're trying to be good people, it ain't going to happen, right? Because we've still broken the law. Therefore, penalty is due. And in that case, basically we're never going to be good enough. And that's why God's like, I will provide. I'll do it for you. And so, he forgives us and he offers that. And so if we trust in Christ, then we are forgiven. Then we're brought into relationship. And that's the starting gun, though, right? We act like that's the finish line. That's the starting gun. For Christians that are wanting to get started on the Bible, I'm definitely going to point you to Chuck Missler's Learn the Bible in 24 Hours. Even though I'm working on this thing, like that's a solid teaching, and it's 24 sessions, and he goes through the whole Bible, and it's good stuff. So I'd say start there. Start reading. This is one of the things that blows my mind. When you actually go and break down the time to read through the Bible in a year, it's an average of 12 to 15 minutes a day. That's it. It takes an average of 70 to 73 hours to read through the whole Bible. The average person spends 2.5 to 5 hours a day on social media and video games or TV. It's usually, I think social media is 2.5 to 4 hours. That's the average.
That's probably on the low end.
Yeah. That means even for most, if you would take just part of that time and still have time left over, I mean, every person could read through the Bible at least once a month. That's kind of crazy to think about when you actually think about time suck and doom scrolling. Now that's a lot to chew off. I'm not just saying, yeah, go read your Bible for 2 hours, but that Bible in a year, you're talking 15 minutes a day. That's easy.
What Bible would you say is a little bit easier to understand in this time and date?
I love the New King James.
Okay.
That's me. I really like the New King James. My dad, and he is not he does not like King James or anything like that. He's like, no, I don't need that, right? And he loves the New King James. My wife loves the New King James, and I just think it's a good, solid translation. It's understandable. I know some people like the ESV. I like the New King James, and so that's not a hard one to go through. It's good language. I like the Greek texts that are under it. That's just me again. But the thing is, and this can be my challenge to everybody on here. Like everything I've said, go and find for yourself. Like take everything I've said and go to the text and test it for yourselves. Make sure that what I'm saying is what it says. You don't take anything I say as just the gospel truth, because I can't do it for you. You've got to make the decision. and receive it with an open mind. And this is kind of like Acts 17:11 is really important. Paul had gone from Thessalonica to Berea. He presented them the gospel, and they took the gospel message that Paul preached, the Apostle Paul, and they tested it against the text to see if what he was saying was true, and they're commended for it. It says these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word with all readiness of mind, but they searched the scriptures daily whether those things were so. And then Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 says, test all things and hold fast to that which is good. And that's where knowing our Bible, especially in today, you asked about where we're headed today. That is why it is so important for us as Christians to know the Bible. Because in a world of lies, you've got to know what the truth says and know how to test it. And so I like the New King James. And but get one. Get one and start reading it.
Right on, man. Well, from me, from the Team Trek family, man, I just want to say thank you so much for coming by. Everything you told us today, it was pure gold. I'm sure everybody at home got a lot out of it too, man. We're going to make sure and put a link down in the description to your podcast so people can go check those out. How long do those generally run, your podcasts?
Anywhere from hour to hour and a half. It's only on Friday mornings. Again, it's just something small, just encourage people. That's really kind of the whole point of that. My TikTok is where I do a lot of like the questions or responses or biblical teaching stuff on there. That's where that get a lot deeper. I mean, we do go deep on the podcast at times, depending on what we're talking about. Yeah, that's.
It's kind of a large order. Do you try to respond to any questions that people write in about?
Yeah. I try to respond to as many as I can.
Okay, awesome. So yeah,
because I'm retired. Like this, I'm in ministry full time. Like I consider my life a ministry. So this is what I do.
That's okay. Awesome. So we can definitely write in if we have any questions, anything like that. And definitely want people to go check out your site, follow you, and share your word. Share the words that you're putting out there. And I agree with you. I think we are going in a bad direction right now, and I think we can all take a step back, take some direction, and start going in that right positive manner, right? I mean, we as individuals, when we link up with other people, we start. I'm not going to say preaching so much as just having conversations.
Yeah, that's it. Sow seeds, sow seed and water. It doesn't mean you beat people over the head with it, but be there for each other. And then when the opportunity arises, you'll know what to say. You just be prepared for it. You know what I mean? That's the big thing. Like you just have to be there for people and build those relationships. It's networking. It's what we always. It's what we're good at. It's like that's the thing is like you don't have to stop operating. It's just your environment changes.
Well, and you just said it. Opportunities, right?
Yeah.
We all have opportunities right there in front of us. We can choose every day if we want to make somebody's day better or somebody's day worse. And I think we should just all do a better job taking those opportunities and taking a little bit of time to try to help somebody out. Yeah. So again, Paul, I can't thank you enough, man.
Yeah, man, definitely. And if anybody wants like to reach out, like you can email me, Paul@thewarriorsrising.com, because that's my website is warriorsrising.com, connected to the podcast too. So awesome. Yeah, man, I really appreciate you having me on, man. Like, definitely, it's an honor to be on here.
Anytime, and anytime you want to come back through, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, man.
So, appreciate it, Paul. All right, brother.